Good morning, everybody, and good morning, everybody on radio. Good morning, everybody in video. Welcome to Your City, Your Voice on this Monday, November the 11th, Remembrance Day, coming to you live from the studios of 4680Q in downtown Niagara Falls. Today, my co-host, Dave Wheeler, is in the studio, and we're going to be talking about Remembrance Day. We're going to pay tribute to all those who fought for the freedoms we enjoy today. Those that paid the ultimate price, those that are retired from the service and living amongst us, and those that are serving around the world, keeping our freedom intact today. We thank them, remember them, and honor them today. This show is brought to you by Wild Bill's Auto Repair and Body Shop at Victoria Avenue's Pete's Pizza. And Dave, I'd like to start the show with a reading of In Flanders Fields, written by Canadian physician Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae. Dave?
Please do. Yeah. You want me to read it?
Absolutely.
Oh, do you have
read
a copy?
You read it so well. I don't have it.
I'll bring up a copy. I thought, okay.
That's right. Dave will bring it up on his phone. We're going to read it Flanders Fields first. And I hope I don't choke up here, because every time Dave reads in Flanders Fields, and we have it on the show, I get all choked up, paying respect to our veterans.
Yeah.
Just hang tight. Yeah. Dave's going to bring it up, and we're going to go through it. I think I surprised him here.
Yeah, I did. I didn't think I would be reading it. I thought you were going to read it. Yeah,
you do a great job every year.
Okay, I'll see if I can keep it together when I do that. I already got goosebumps when you started the show. In Flanders Fields by John McCrae. In Flanders Fields the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields. Almost didn't make it.
I know. Yeah, that's tough to read, tough to even listen to.
Think of the young men, all in a trench in Flanders Fields, and they're talking and joking around one day, goofing around. Then a missile or a bomb, or they go over the top, and that's them. And you might not even find their bodies. It might be blown to bits. There's hundreds of thousands of bodies still in the fields of the First World War, and that was it. A young man's life snuffed out. Yesterday you watched him laugh and goof around with his pals. The next day he's gone forever. His wife or his girlfriend, his sisters and his brothers, never see him again. And his mother will be heartbroken forever.
And they were a lot of our relatives, family, friends. And even to this day, we remember them, and that's what this day's all about. Now, Dave, I want to have a moment of silence in honor of the brave men and women who fought and died and continued to fight the worldwide wars for our country. Thank you to everyone. We're going to talk about today. I know it is touching. We're going to talk about several important Canadian contributions to the war effort today. The landing at Juno Beach on D-Day, and a little, I wouldn't say little known. They were known, but they weren't talked about a lot from what I can see. The Canadian Merchant Marine. But first, a little bit about the man that wrote In Flanders Fields that touches everybody on Remembrance Day, Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae. Now, he was born in Guelph, John McCrae, in 1872. He was a Canadian poet, physician, author, artist, and soldier during World War One. A surgeon during the Second Battle of Ypres.
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 Mm-hmm.
Ypres, is that how you
Yeah,
pronounce
yeah,
it?
yeah, yeah. I used to pronounce it that way too, but I think it's just Ypres.
Ypres,
Yeah.
okay. In Belgium. He wrote the poem after losing a friend in Ypres and seeing poppies growing in the battle scarred fields. He fought in many battles, including Second Boer War, Battle of Belfast, Battle of Leliefontein, First World War, Second Battle of Ypres, and on the Western Front. Lieutenant Colonel McCrae died of pneumonia near the end of the war on January 20th, 1918, in Boulogne-sur-Mer, France. And you always hear the poem in Flanders Fields, and I don't know if anybody really knew the gentleman behind this, but this was a talented man who did all this. Not just a soldier. He was a physician, a poet, author, artist. He did Canada proud, and yeah, I don't know. He maybe gets a lot of recognition, but I really didn't know a lot about the gentleman until I really looked him up and found out about it. And I thought it would be great for everybody else to know about his accomplishments and in the war and in writing in Flanders Fields.
Something interesting. The American schools in France used that poem. So American schools for Americans in France used that poem, and I wondered if it was used other places in the United States as well. But that was a surprise to me when the little kids, American kids, in school in France and around whatever I think they whatever day they observe. This is probably one that they do observe. The little kids read this poem out, but it is a poem that just really, you know, tells you exactly what you can feel it, And I think you're right that he was a very talented man. He was a surgeon. Back in those days, they had more like Renaissance men back then too. The guys would be not only surgeons and artists and poets. They did a bunch of different things. They would apply their mind to many different aspects of life. I don't know, just and then he left that as his most well known legacy.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing his accomplishments in the short life he lived.
We don't
Died
know how many.
19.
We don't know how many lives he saved.
Yeah. Oh well, he was born in 1872. So what does that put him at? Like 46 years old, I guess, when he
Yeah.
died.
Well, he was working probably full time, putting the Canadian boys back together. Right. Yeah. I don't know how many guys he must have saved. How many lives he must have saved fighting in the First World War like that. And they have people who watched him write that poem, and he changed it a few times here and there. And as a matter of fact, it came down in different forms because one person might have got an unfinished copy or this or that. So that was the final version, but there was a break in the action, and he was able to get outside and just take a breather, and he's writing it down, and people witnessed him writing it down. And so you can imagine what it was like, what a hellhole it was like. You know that the casualties, actually, Canada lost more people in the First World War than it did the Second World War, with a much smaller population. It was a buzzsaw. The French lost over 1 million of their young, strong men. The British lost 500,000 of their young, strong men. It was just a butcher field. It was a bloodbath. So a guy like, Lieutenant Colonel McCrae, he would be uh, every day looking at this. If the battle wasn't on, an emergency, then he'd be still stitching guys up and trying to save them and get them someplace where they could get further treatment.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing what hell our boys and women went through in the war. And here we are today honoring them, and that's why. That's
We
why.
buried a lot of of nurses over there as well. I don't know if I told the story on this show before, but I remember the testimony of a young nurse. She was a very old girl then. It was in the 70s, and they were talking. Somebody had wise enough gone around and talk about people and their war stories before they've all passed on. They had an old girl there, and she had been a nurse, and she was a young nurse, and they put her on the first night, baptism by fire. She was to a Canadian boy had a bayonet wound in the gut. So these took a long time for the guys to die. They're going to die, but it took a long time. So they wanted to just toughen her up right away. So she's talked to a young man lying on a bed with a bayonet wound, and he was going to die, but he stayed alive a long time. So she got to talk to him and stay with him and get to know him. And of course, she watched him eventually just fade and die. And that broke her heart. But the next day, she was up and ready to go. She was familiarized with what happened. So we don't think about the nurses that often. We think about the doctors sometimes, the soldiers, but the nurses were there working steady, relieving pain, talking to the soldiers, watching them die and taking their last oath or whatever they might have to say. It was tough on them. And you think that nurse there would ever forget that experience? Never.
No, no, that stays with them for life. And in those days, they didn't have the triage that they have today. They were doing this right on the battlefield, probably in a tent or something.
They would try to find some place a little off the lines, protected, a little bit protected, try to get it somewhere outside, but that was no guarantee. We buried a lot of nurses over there, and sometimes they died of disease, sometimes wounds, but they were buried over there. But they also saved a lot of lives.
Oh, they did. They did. And I mean, the procedures, the medicine they had then was nothing close to what they have today, of course. So even saving one life a lot of times was probably close to a miracle.
That's right. Yeah.
So God bless them and God bless everybody who was over there because, man, oh man, we're a lucky generation.
We certainly are. We didn't have to go to war.
No, we're a very lucky generation here, So it's even more important you wear a poppy and remember those who did go to war for us, so we wouldn't have to.
Exactly.
So great. So let's move on to Juno Beach now. Juno Beach was one of 5 beaches in the Allied invasion of German-occupied France in the Normandy landings on June 6th, 1944. We hear a lot about Omaha, right? The Omaha Beach one where the Americans were. We hear a lot about that, Omaha.
We never stop hearing about it. But that's the way the Americans are. They won the war, of course.
Yeah, of course. But that was the responsibility of the U.S. Army, and they went in there, and of course, they tell the story. There were heavy losses, though, and the Americans suffered 2,400 casualties, but 34,000 Allied troops landed by nightfall. But the Canadian Canadian Army and Navy had just as tough an assignment, maybe even tougher, the taking of Juno Beach.
That's right. I have to thank an American historian for realizing that. I thought it was just one of the other beaches, and it was kind of just a tough beach, but nothing like Omaha. But when I found out that among the attacking force, the Canadians lost more per percentage. They lost 19 men per 1,000, whereas the Americans lost 18 per 1,000 on Omaha Beach. So what's that tell you? They had a completely different objective too. They had to hit a town, and they had these killings. They have very, very high break wall that today, if you saw it, is only partly as high as it used to be because sand has come up on that break wall. But it was very high break wall, and it had pillboxes on killing zones, all focused down the beaches. And then after you got past the break wall, a lot of the fortifications were in place in the buildings and houses. That's one of the reasons why they didn't pre-bomb the areas like they did on the other beaches as much, is because they didn't want to kill the people in the town. There's too many people, and they didn't want to kill those people. So the Canadians had the misfortune of having to go into areas where it was not pre-cleared by Navy or Air Force bombardment. And they just they cut them to pieces. The first wave, I think they lost almost all their guys, 85% casualties on the first wave. Then they finally got a foothold, and they went inch by inch by inch. And then they hit, and once they got their stride, it was okay. Of course, one of the most famous stories is Scotty from Star Trek. he was there. He was with the Canadian commandos, and he hit the beach, and he took out a sniper nest, and he got wounded, and so he was the real soldier. When you watch Star Trek, he was the real thing, right? He was the real thing. He actually did those things. So anyway, he was I think he was with the BC unit. Anyway, so they just had these killing zones and snipers and all the rest. And what the Canadians did, they persevered. The beach was bloody. It was sticky with blood. Sticky with blood. They were talking about that on one of the shows I was watching. And they came over and then they had to go house to house because they didn't know which ones were fortified. And still they had the idea they got to watch out for citizens. Probably most of the citizens had hightailed it by that time, but and they managed to get, instead of hitting it face on, they managed to get around it and hit it from the side, which was quite the little town. So they had three towns along the way they had to take. So they had a wholly different type of landing than the others. The others landed on beaches. And once they passed the fortification, there was openings. Not the Canadians. They had to hit this town, and the towns were fortified, and a lot of urban fighting.
Yeah, they call it the most heavily defended of the beaches, of the beachfront proper. They called it the Devil's Garden. Yeah. And they had to wade through all this to get to these pillboxes or whatever, and the positions that the Germans held up on the top of that wall, of that break wall in the city.
And those gun emplacements could not be taken out because of how well they were built. And they didn't face the sea. They had openings so they could hit the beaches, but they couldn't be hit by armaments from the sea. So they had these killing zones all set up, and the troops that were fighting, Canadian fighting, were trained specifically for that task. Right? I mean, they weren't elite troops like they met a little bit later, but there were troops, very good troops. They weren't kids. These weren't the kid troops, the 18-year-olds and the 16-year-olds. They were good, pretty, your rank and file army guy trained specifically for this assault. So they knew what they were doing, and they had the gunpowder.
Well, they could muster armored defense in that area, which a lot of the other places they couldn't.
That's right. Lo and behold, after the Canadians were supposed to unite sword and gold beaches,
yes,
because they're right in the middle of those two beaches, and they were supposed to connect with the Brits on the left and the Brits on the right. But guess what? They connected with the Brits on the right, so the left. So they did that job, and they turned around and looked to the right, and what happened to be sitting there? An SS Panzer Division.
Yeah.
What do you want? A green troops? What do they want to hit? An SS Panzer Division.
Yeah, and it said that the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division made it the farthest into occupied France of all of them. And it was a source of national pride in Canada because they got so far, this division of the 2nd Division of Canadian Infantry.
Yeah, they had to wait for the other allies to make their goals. So they did very, very well, astonishingly well.
Yeah,
and then I told you about a little bit. So they had to hit this in their. Of course, their losses were high. They're higher than that Omaha Beach, and so they made it. They made it into town, and they start making their progress, hitting crossroads that they were supposed to hit, and then and of course they hit the Panzer Division. But that is another story. Was it June 8th? Was it June 8th? They hit the Panzer Division, and
yes,
and they had at first the Panzer Division kind of got the better of them, but these were vicious commanders in the SS unit and massacred some of the Canadian soldiers that they caught. A little later on, a few days later, the Canadians got back at them on June 8th, set up a trap for them in a town called Bretteville. And they managed to take out a half track and a tank right on the main bridge, stop the Panzer Division coming. And when, and it's a typical Canadian story, they fought like crazy, held them back. The Panzer Division tries to end run them, and they meet Canadian resistance all set up, but the Canadians don't have any armor with them. They have artillery pieces, which holds back the Panzers for a while. But then the Panzers start to make some ground on them, as it would. And then who shows up? Who shows up? Sherman Fireflies. Well, a group of 12 Sherman tanks, about 6 or 7 of them were Fireflies. And a Sherman Firefly, is a tank that the British modified. So they took a Sherman tank, and the Shermans were underpowered, underarmed and underpowered, basically. A really good tank, but when it came fighting the other tank, it wasn't all that good. And so the Brits put a 17-pounder in their turret. They took away the American gun and put 17-pounder, which is about 76, a little over 76 millimeter. Now this is capable of taking out Panzers. So this group of tankers were moving up to deliver these tanks to the First Army Division, and who do they see broadside? A bunch of tanks. And so they said, "Oh, that must be our guys." Until they got closer, and they, "Oh, they're Germans," and they went and they hit them. They knocked the whole pile of them out. I think 12 in that whole engagement altogether, which was a severe blow to the Germans at the time because they couldn't replace tanks very quickly.
Yeah, yeah, they were coming from. Well, I mean, they were inland, but they would have got there, but not in time.
Yeah, and it happened like so they're last, and they have Firefly just in time. It's a typical Canadian story.
Yeah, well, they hoped that all the shelling that they were doing on Juno Beach um, before the landing would soften up the German batteries, but they didn't have the effect that they thought they would have. And what rough weather forced the delay of the first assault. So they bombed these positions. Then the guys were supposed to go in, but because of bad weather, they couldn't get in. So that's kind of screwed up the softening them up and getting right on them. But there was a lot of individual stories of heroism. I mean,
God, yes.
Guys running up by themselves and throwing grenades into bunkers and stuff like that to wipe out some of the nests, right?
The one I like was the guy. They know the road is mined, and they know there's soldiers there, and they don't know quite what to do, so they just decided just to go anyway. And the guy that leads them down the street, well, he steps on a mine, but he takes a bullet at the same time, which hits him in the head, but doesn't just hits him in the helmet, knocks him so far away from the mine. So when he stepped off the mine, he was outside of the blast zone. that's right out of
Is
3
that the
stages.
guy who ran up and went in there with the Luger and shot them all in there? Or he came up on the blind side of the bunker?
That was I think a different guy.
Was that another guy? Yeah. There's some really guys who really did some wild stuff, but man, oh man, without guys like that.
I know. Well, Scotty, the Jim Dugan, who is, I think it's Jim Dugan. Patrick Dugan. Yeah, Patrick Dugan.
Patrick Dugan, I think.
Yeah, he was a real life commando from Canada, and he did those things. He later on, after he was wounded, he ended up flying airplanes. I guess he was quite a reckless dude. Yeah, flying.
He was handling those dilithium crystals.
Yeah, I guess.
Didn't even bother him. But what a battle! And they took heavy casualties, but they eventually got to their mark. They wanted to. The Third Canadian Infantry Division was to cut off the Cane Bayou Road, seize the Carpiquet Airport, and form a link between the two British beaches on either flank.
Yeah,
and they accomplished their mission.
Yeah, they sure
did. At the end of the day.
Yeah.
But they took heavy casualties. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles and the Queen's Own Rifles, they were the first wave that went in, and they took very heavy casualties. But as more brigades were dispatched, the coastal defenses were eventually cleared, and they made their way inland.
There's also a story that's not often told is about the Canadian paratroopers. Of course, the Brits had paratroopers, the Americans did, the Canadians did as well. And the Canadian paratroopers went in behind lines, but they got messed up because they started taking flak, and the planes had to drop them wherever they could, because otherwise they wouldn't make it back to Britain. So they sent them, they gave them the green light to jump. But once they got down there were like 7 or 8 miles away from their jump zones and all that. They managed to get themselves all together, and then make a concerted effort to withhold, to stop Germans resupplying the beaches. And if they hadn't done that, they would have been able to open up, and they were counterattacked once they got themselves back together. So here they are, dropped, confused, out of the all over the place in the dark. They managed to get themselves together and put up a resistance for a German counterattack that, if they had failed to stop them, it would have allowed the Germans to reinforce that area.
And probably make it across the water to Britain.
Well, that would have been tough. That would have been tough, but they would have been able to hit them back at the beaches, maybe push them back in if they got that. But those paratroopers stopped them. It's a really good story about the paratroopers. There's lots and lots of good stories, things you don't hear. But Canadians don't go around and trumpet their great thing. They don't make great movies. They don't make movies about how we won the war. The Brits and the Americans do, but we don't. We don't go around telling everybody how great we did and how wonderful we are. The Brits and the Americans do that. We're kind of like wallflowers. We come to the party, we do what we have to do, and then we leave, and everybody else takes the glory.
Yeah, and although there's a lot of stories of bravery in that, the Canadians took a total of 1,096 casualties in the invasion, with 381 killed in action. Total Allied D-Day casualties reached more than 10,000 at the end of the day.
Yep.
By the end of the Battle of Normandy, that was what it was called, the Battle of Normandy, and the invasion took place in 5 different beaches, I believe, right? 5 different fronts.
Yeah. The Americans then started to break out, and they went westward, and they took the not Sherbrooke. Anyway, they went west, and there was a big port there, right in Brittany. They took that out. They controlled that, and they came back. So when they were holed up in Cherbourg, I think it is Cherbourg, when the Americans were there, there's a good story about David Niven getting an Iron Cross, because he was hiding behind one of these bridges during D-Day, and he was getting shot up like everyone else. And in the first, or either at D-Day or the first few days after, and an American he bumped into that he knew got a bunch of Iron Crosses, because they came out of a plane that was supposed to be dropping these Iron Crosses for the Germans that were holding out in Sherbrooke. Not Sherbrooke. Damn, I can't remember that name. Anyway, so they were holding out there, and the Iron Crosses were supposed to go for them because they were doing such a good job. But it fell into his hands, and so he was giving them out. So that's why some British and American soldiers got an Iron Cross.
Yeah. But
I gotta look that up.
It was like the Allies suffered an astounding 209,000 casualties, and Canadian casualties in Normandy exceeded 18,700, and over 5,000 Canadian soldiers were killed when it was all over.
Well, you look at the population at the time. In 1945, Canada had 12 million people. The United States had 11 times more people than we'd had. So if you wanted to compare them, you'd have to multiply one by 11, or ours by 11, to see how it compares to the States. They compare similarly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the Brits too, I think. Of course, the greatest losses during the war were the Russian soldiers. They lost probably nearly 13 million fighting men, which, when you think of all of the Allied losses, it's like about 12 or 20 times as much. I don't know what it is. It's huge, but we fought. Our boys fought really well. They did what they had to do, and then a little later on, they marched up the east side, took the east flank, and took the surrender of Netherlands. And they weren't supposed to do that. Both the Brits and the Americans, I think, were arguing who's gonna take the surrender, but the Germans offered it to Canadians because they were the ones that were there.
Well, this Battle of Normandy here and all that probably was the beginning of the end for the Germans. Would you say that?
I would say that's the death knell. Although the the Russians were moving hard and fast on the Eastern Front. They had got their momentum. They had got a specific kind of tactic with these rolling artillery barrages and armor coming after. It was almost impossible to stop. And they were being supplied by the West huge amounts of material. It is one of the things we don't. Another American historian woke me up on this fact that 80% of the war was fought by the Russians and 80% of it was paid by the Americans. The Americans had incredible industrial capacity, incredible industrial uh, techniques and innovations that made supplying the war machine unbelievable. There was no way the Germans were going to win unless they had, got away with making the atomic bomb. Because the war munitions that were coming out of the States, they took everything the Brits had, improved it, they had come up with their own stuff, and they just kept cranking out ship, plane, artillery piece, you name it. It just kept coming and coming, and they supplied the Russians. Canada was part of the supply chain, but we were much smaller, because we were over here on the island, which is called North America. So those things are all should be put into effect. And when you think of the First and Second World War, you have to think of the ladies that were in the factories building the armaments.
Rosie right? The Riveter.
Rosie the Riveter. And that was in Britain and Canada and New Zealand and Australia and all those places. But our Canadian ladies did their work here. They held down the front here. They were the ones that helped production. So those things can't be forgotten either. It was the whole country was in on it. There was over 1 million people in Canada. I think 1.12 million people out of 12 million were in the armed forces. Now you take 12 million, and a section of that population are the seniors, and another section of it are the kids. So that section of people that were actually old enough to serve, almost everybody that could did.
Yeah, and this Juno Beach story, you take a look at the World War II and World War I even, and you look at some of the battles Canadians fought. And, like, we don't get a lot of credit, but the Canadians were really, really considered the fiercest and toughest fighters of them all. And when they needed something done, they usually called the Canadians to get it done.
Yeah, they did, and the Germans had a lot of respect for the Canadian soldiers in both wars, and so they did what they had to do. And like I said, they're the wallflowers at the party. Basically, they came to the party, they did what they had to do, and they left. But everybody else does all the hooting and hollering. That story of Bretteville and how that story happened, because that SS division we were talking about murdered Canadians, right? A war crime. The guy that was in charge later was hanged in Nuremberg for that war crime. They came back and they got their revenge. I mean, if that was an American story, you would have heard that. There would have been 10 movies about that by now, right? But most Canadians don't even know what happened.
Yeah, man. That's the way it was. I mean, I think what did I read? The people from the Netherlands, they're still thinking Canadians.
Sure, they if you get Netflix, there's a movie called The Forgotten Battle, and it follows it follows a British soldier around, but actually it ends up being about a huge battle that Canadians had with the Germans in Netherlands, and it was right up in actually a kind of a resistance movement, sort of help the Canadians in that one, or else it would have been a huge bloodbath. But it's called The Forgotten Battle, and the reason why it's Forgotten Battle is, like I said, if it was the Brits or the Americans, we would have had 5 movies about them by now.
And speaking of the Forgotten Battle, the Canadian Merchant Marine was called the Forgotten Navy. So we're going to talk about that here for a minute. It was an overlooked but important part of World War II, the Canadian Merchant Navy. A total of 12,000 men and women served in this part of the Canadian Armed Forces, and by the war's end, 1,500 had died, including 8 women, and 184 ships were involved in protecting shipping activity, including the Great Lakes, because the Great Lakes, in especially Sault Ste. Marie, was where the ships came with iron ore to get to places in the United States like Cleveland and these other places, and supplied them so they could do what you were saying, make the machines that were needed for war, make the armaments and everything with that iron ore. So they were protected too, Dave.
Yes, yeah, that's a good point. As a matter of fact, there's an old movie about a guy that was he won't. I saw it once, and he won't. It'd be pretty hard to find it. It's a movie. It's an American movie, actually, I think, and it's about a guy that a guy a little bit older, but he's in charge. He's a soldier guarding the Welland Canal, and a German sub guy was, I think it was a sub commander. He managed to escape, land in Canada, up or maybe in James Bay or something, and escape. And he was making his way. He was going to make his way into the States before they were into the war yet. And he was able to. He found a reason why he could stop this guy and arrest him. It's kind of clever the way he did it, but you would think it's so that gives you an idea. Even people who were marching up and down the Welland Canal with rifles, right, just in case. Now the Merchant Marine, I'll give you an idea. They they were if you talk to old Merchant Marine men that I have in the past, they all lined up to join the Navy, but the country said to them, "No, no, no. We need you more on those ships, those supply ships. We need those supply ships. They are a vital line. We can get guys for the Navy, but we can't get good sailors for the Merchant Marine. You're a vital supply." So they said, "Okay, they'll do that," and they paid them a little more to do that as well. After the war, though, like the Canadian government thought it would get pretty damn stingy and not recognize them as soldiers in the effort, sailors in the effort. This, despite the fact that 1 out of every 8 merchant seamen died. 1 out of 8, and one of the highest casualty rates of any service. I think it was the most in Canada. So 1 out of 8 sailors that served died. At one time, for 31 days in a row, the Germans sank at least one 10,000-ton ship. 10,000-ton ship could carry enough food to uh, keep 220,000 people alive for a week or something.
Yeah, they were used to patrol those shipping lanes in the Atlantic, right? Because there had to be supply lines, not only of troops, but of armored vehicles and munitions and that kind of thing, all going to the front in Europe,
Yeah.
right? So these ships that were hauling this stuff, and I think they even commissioned Lakers to haul this stuff from the Great Lakes. They had to be protected, and the Merchant Marine was what protected them. And these guys weren't like naval destroyers or anything. They had like boats with guns, armaments, but like you said, they didn't have a lot of protection.
No, they were sitting ducks, and believe me, the Germans were not. They'll take out a Navy ship. They could do that too. But what they really wanted to do is take out any supplies, because they were in a stranglehold. It was like a siege, and there's this zone called the Black Pit, I think they called it, where it's outside the range of any aircraft, either from Iceland or Britain or from the other way around. The Black Pit is where they got mostly shot or torpedoed. And when they did get torpedoed, they never knew what was going to happen. They're going to end up in the sea, all covered in oil. They could have been any number of things. And then the other ships couldn't stop to pick them up, because back in the day when they did, even the Navy ships, when they tried to pick these guys up, they would have to slow down, and that would make them a target.
Yeah, U-boats were a big problem. Winston Churchill said that he wasn't worried about anything else except U-boats.
Yeah, the Wolfpack.
Yeah, they're gonna be the ones, and like they're in the Atlantic, but don't think they weren't in close to Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, and they made it right up to within 180 miles of Quebec City.
Yes, as a matter of fact, they used to go so close to the United States shore that they would come up at night and they'd watch the cars going up and down the highway. That's how close they were there.
And they sunk 20 ships and warships in the St. Lawrence Seaway.
Yeah,
And they were
they were
unbelievable.
They were bold. They were well trained and well equipped, but they were very bold.
And that's why they had guys walking the Welland Canal.
Yes.
In case one of these friggin' things slipped through and got into the locks or something, and who knows, right?
Yeah. So there's a little bit of substance when you asked your girlfriend to go down to the Welland Canal and watch the submarine races.
Yeah, exactly. You never know what was going to pop up.
Yeah, I knew it was going to pop up.
But yeah, well, the Merchant Navy played a vital role in the Battle of the Atlantic, and it was said that the Battle of the Atlantic was not won by Air Force or Navy. It was won by the courage, fortitude, and determination of the British and Allied Merchant Marine.
Yes. And they kept those supplies going. They were sitting ducks. They had no protection. They worked in the worst weather of all time. And then the Canadian government turns their back on them. After the end of the war, they said, oh, no, you're not going to get the pensions. You're not going to get anything like that. And they said, why? You asked us to do this. It was part of the war effort. You told us. You told us how wonderful we were at the beginning. And now you're turning your back on it. It took them years to get that. And they are an essential part of the war effort. And I mean, the war could not have transpired without them. And they lost 1 in 8. Seriously?
That's a lot.
And then the government turns their back on them. But that's not unusual. Governments of all kinds like to turn their back on their soldiers when it comes to paying out money a little later on. It happened to my great-great-grandfather when he was in the Civil War. They didn't want to pay him his pension. He had to get, of course, he was illiterate. He couldn't write his own letters, so he had to get somebody else to do it for him. But yeah, and I found out a little later on that the government was astonished how many of these old guys survived. They didn't want it. They were really slow in getting the money out to them, hoping that more of them would die before that would happen.
Well, veteran status and benefits were denied the Merchant Marine until 1988.
Yes.
What's that, like 40 years after the war? Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Now, isn't that embarrassment? That's an embarrassment.
It's an embarrassment.
They've righted that. They finally righted that. But I cannot understand why nobody stood up and said that. Now, an old neighbor of mine lived across the street from me in Scarborough. He was in the Merchant Marine during the war. He also, I think, been in the Navy before that, in the Merchant Marine. And they gave him a call. When it came time for the D-Day thing, they gave him a call and said, we want you now. We want you here. We want you as a representative because you deserve to be here. And he was shocked. So they paid his way and everything, all the way to wherever the celebrations were. My parents told me that story because they had bumped into him.
So we talked about the Battle of the Atlantic,
Mr.
Right?
Whitten.
Mr. Whitten. Battle of the Atlantic, if anybody doesn't know what that is, ran from 1939 1945, and at its core was the blockade of Germany and pitted German U-boats, a German Kriegsmarine Navy, and aircraft of the Luftwaffe against Royal Navy, Royal Canadian Navy, U.S. Navy, and Allied merchant shipping. Convoys of troops, weapons, and supplies were protecting the shipping lanes coming from the North Atlantic in the Battle of the North Atlantic, or the Atlantic, and the Merchant Marine was responsible to escort all these ships. So, when you talk about supply lines and troops and ammunition and whatever else these boats could carry, supplies, food, medical supplies, everything was dependent on the Merchant Marine to protect them.
Yeah.
When they're in those shipping lanes, it's amazing that they did that. I mean, and the U-boats were a constant threat, like you said, and they had to watch for everything. These guys on boats that were really poorly armed, they weren't ready for combat. Let me put it that way.
Well, the ones the Merchant Marines had very low. They might have had one small gun on them. Most of the time, they didn't really have much armaments because they needed as much available space for as much goods as they could put on these ships. And they would be escorted by the Canadian Navy and the Royal Navy and they would be you'd be using the Corvairs, were they? Yeah, I think they were the Corvairs. They were a very small, quick, nimble battleship, good for chasing down subs, but very unstable. So it took quite a while. Took a good captain and crew to keep them going, but they were quick and sharp on the target. The and anyway, they, like I said, at one time they had 31 in a row, 31 days in a row where these ships went down, at least one 10,000-ton ship every day for 31 days. Incredible cost to the Allies. And you can imagine how many men were in the water and they couldn't get them out. And the other merchant marines, when I heard them talking on different documentaries and that, they just watched their guys. They had to leave them there as they zip by, and just kind of resigned the fact that they might be there one day watching a ship go by too.
Yeah.
So,
well, I know that there were the Great Lakes Fleet had 133 Lakers involved, and they were eventually called up for the ocean convoy duties.
Yep.
So
any ship you could throw into it, and the Brits came up with this thing called this kind of a ship, eventually called the Liberty ship. It was a really, really simple kind of cargo ship, very simple, plain cargo ship, but it was perfect. Now they handed it over to the Americans, right? And they said, "This, can you build these for us? We can't build anymore because we don't have the capacity." The Americans looked at it pretty quick. Their industrialists took a quick look at it, and they started cranking them out really, really fast. So when you think of the workhorses of the Second World War, you think of the tanks and the planes and all that. But that simple Liberty ship that the Brits designed and the Americans were able to produce in huge amounts, that was the thing you have to say saved the world as well. Because if they didn't make so many of them and get them pushing cargo back and forth across the two oceans, then the war would be lost. So heads up to those folks.
The merchant marine, and they played a big part in Sault Ste. Marie, up around the Sault Ste. Marie area, because all of the iron ore, like I said, from the United States came up through there, and I think there was even a fort by Sault Ste. Marie that guarded the entrance to the locks.
Oh, probably, yeah.
Sault Ste. Marie to swing over to Lake Superior, right?
And was the iron ore coming in from Duluth, probably? Eh?
Probably, yeah, down, that way, and then around over to the big industrial centers, Cleveland, Pittsburgh.
That's where the coal was, yeah,
and steel mills, maybe even to Buffalo, right?
Sure, because Buffalo, Cleveland, Erie, they all had big steel mills, right?
Yes,
in those days. Don't have
Pennsylvania
now, but
steel town. I mean, so you figure that iron ore had to get there because they had to make they had to make the steel for the ships and everything else, tank ships. Everybody in Detroit, every major car company, their plants were turned into places to make vehicles. They're tanks and planes and you name it, whatever they could make there, they did. They changed them all around to do that.
Well, the Packard car plant was famous for making the British Merlin engine. They even called it the L Packard, the Packard Merlin after a while, because they were able to produce them very well, very quick. The Brits couldn't do it. They'd come up with the best engine for an airplane. They ended up putting them in the Curtiss, or the Mustang, pardon me, which was the fastest prop plane at the time.
P-51.
Well, the P-51 was a good strafing plane, but the fastest fighter was the Mustang prop plane, and they used the Merlin.
What, the Merlin engines?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because they had them before, and they couldn't get the distance and the height. But the Brits came up with the Merlin, Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. But of course, they couldn't produce it that fast. They could produce a few for themselves, but they handed over to the Americans, and Packard in particular, grabbed it, and away they went. So the innovation of the American industry at that time was probably, along with the Soviet soldiers for volume, how many Soviet soldiers were and how much American money, and that was probably the two key factors that won the war for us. But we played our part big time.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, two big battles, a big battle, Juno Beach, and the Merchant Marine, who nobody really hears a lot about.
Merchant Marine are very, very special, and the government was very wrong to do what they did. They tried to save money at the end of the war and disavow the Merchant Marine. Oh well, you're private, you're not part of the military. Well, you the guys told us that you wanted us to do this. You know, you were the ones that begged us to stay on these ships. We wanted to go join up in the Army or the Navy, and you guys told us no, no, no. And now you're telling us now we're not part of the war effort.
Yeah, and actually, after the First World War was over, the Merchant Marine kind of went by to the sideline. They weren't even around really, and then they reinstated them in 1939. They said, "We need you. Get back into this war here."
Well,
the
Merchant Marine just dissolved into regular sailors who worked on ships for commerce.
Yeah.
And then once the war came, the Merchant Marine were now focused on getting war supplies back and forth, not other things like they might have done during peacetime.
Yeah, and it was like help, and then they all came running, and they got on boats, and away they went to protect everybody. So it's crazy how that worked. They were a big part of World War I as well. They were out there in World War I, steaming around, making sure the shipping lanes were clear and everything for World War I.
Yep. And bringing a lot of cargo in, all kinds of cargo for Britain.
Yeah, and after it was finished, they were I think they were first started in like 1914, and then they were thrown into the war effort in probably around 18, somewhere around there. I think it said.
Well, the Canadian Navy had been and Merchant Marine had been supplying Britain for a very long time, and remember this is wartime. So in the First World War, they were the main source of supply for Britain, basically because they're too far away for the Germans to attack them. So, and until the Americans came 3 years after the war started, in the Second World War too, Canadians were the number one place by which goods were launched to Britain before the Americans got in the war. But there was that time though that the Americans did the Lend-Lease thing, and they gave them lent them all kinds of equipment and things like that to be paid for later. Well, who do you think was shipping that across?
Yeah,
the Merchant Marine.
Yep, they were, and they were founded in like 1914, and then they were called up in 1918, and they were called the Canadian Merchant Marine.
Yeah, right? Probably before that there would be the Royal Merchant Marine. They would have been blended with the Brits. So all they did was really change their name from the Royal to the.
Then after the war, they kind of faded away. But within hours of the declaration of war on Germany, hello, Merchant Marine, we need you. Come on, get back on those ships.
Yeah.
So they were a big deal. They were a big part of the war that I really never heard a lot about. And even when I was looking it up, I really didn't find a real lot of information about the people who were there and what they were doing, other than
they weren't even allowed in the Legion.
Yeah,
they weren't allowed to be Legion members. Like seriously, they really did not do them a whole lot of justice.
No, not at all.
Particularly when they lost 1 in 8. And they had 12,000.
A lot of people.
1 out of 8 service.
Now, before I close the show, unless you have anything else you want to add to any of this?
No, just it was nice to talk about that and make sure that people knew that. The importance of the day,
especially on today, importance of today, Remembrance Day. So what I want to do before we close out the show is just mention my sponsors who allowed us to have this tribute show for Remembrance Day. And it's not something that we just do this year. We do this, Dave and I do it every year.
Yeah,
we get together
for this. Yes.
To make sure that we remember those who fought for our freedoms, right? So our sponsors today were Wild Bill's Auto Repair and Body Shop. If you need anything done on your car, give Ken Hunter a call at Wild Bill's Auto Repair and Body Shop. He's going to take care of you. They offer a full service. They have all the diagnostic equipment. They're going to take care of any problems you have. And they also have a full body shop. So they get your car out of their body shop, showroom condition. So you're going to be happy. Your car is going to be happy. Be proactive. Call Ken today at Wild Bill's Auto Repair and Body Shop on Oakwood Drive by the Kia dealership. And our second sponsor, we thank them. And actually, I was there on Saturday to Victoria Avenue Pete's Pizza, and they're all wearing poppies.
Right on. Okay.
Yeah, they were in Poppy's.
Good
Um,
show.
and we thank them for supporting the show. Of course, if you want a pizza and you want a good pizza, believe me, I'm a pizza snob. You want to go and see Pete's Pizza on Victoria Avenue. They're going to cook up a good pizza for you. You're going to be happy. You can dial up 905-374-2222 or just go to pizzavictoria.ca and order your pizza online. And I will attest their wings are great too because I had some of those on Saturday.
Oh, there you go.
So there you go. Anyway, we thank everybody for tuning in. We encourage everybody every year. I know the Remembrance Day is over today, but that's not. But we don't forget our veterans. You see a veteran, thank him for his service, and remember those who died in the bid to keep our freedoms where they are, keep us a free country. Don't forget about them during the year. It's not just one day we honor them.
No, I look at every cenotaph anytime I see one. I take a minute to pause and look at them
Yeah,
because they're young men. Think of the young men. Think of anyone like from 18 to 26, basically. That was the range. Think that, one day, like the poem said, they love them, we're loved. Next day, they're gone.
yeah. Think of your sons and daughters and look at them and say, you know what? Back in 1940s, they'd be going to war. They'd be in the draft.
Yeah.
They'd be in the draft. My father was lucky because he was born in 1926, so it made him 13 years old when the war started. But it went to 45. So 5 years later, when he was 18, he did get to go in. He had to go in, but he never got sent overseas because it was over.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he was in that range where he was a little bit young when it started and it ended before he was sent. But he was into the training. He had to go in his uniform. And my uncle Paul, Paul Lemire, he was actually on the Lancaster. He was in the Air Force and on the Lancaster.
Wow.
He was young.
Was it gunner? Gunner and navigator or something?
Yeah, some a gunner maybe or something. Yeah, he was on the Lancaster. He flew, and he was in the war. But
that was almost a death sentence in the Lancasters. They could get a lot of missions up there, but sooner or later
they lost a lot.
Yeah.
That's why there's only 2 left running in the world.
Yeah.
But he was young, so he only got there he wasn't in for long. So he survived the whole thing, right? That's where he was, but I don't know if he actually flew any missions because he was like my dad's age. Yeah. So at that point, he went in and he was on the Lancaster, but I don't know how many missions he flew or anything. Maybe none. They're young, right?
Yeah.
But think about you look at your 18-year-old son or daughter and think, like,
Yeah.
and today's, we're not free from this today. Neither. There's a lot of stuff going on right now, and if it went south fast, there could be a draft in that.
Well, I was talking to a woman and she was worried about her sons because of what's happening in the geopolitical universe right now.
That's right. That's right. So, think of it. Think of our veterans and those who served us all year, not just today. Go by a Cenotaph, stop for a minute. Think of what they went through as kids, fighting for our freedoms and that kind of thing.
As you passed by the armory where the young men were mustering, can you imagine they're mustering there and a couple of girls be walking by and they'd be trying to get to know the girls and everything, and the girls would get to know them and hope, well, when they come back, I'll talk to them, and then find out a few months later they're not coming back.
Yeah, sad, huh? Yeah. Sad. That's why when I see any of these young kids in the military reserves, or when you see them in their uniforms, or anywhere, even when I'm in the United States and I see some, the people in reserves or whatever walking around in their uniform and that, I stop them and I thank them. Yeah, I thank them for their service. And they don't get enough of that. I don't think people, just.
I think people are like, particularly in the States, are very, very much aware of it. Every time you have a lacrosse game, when I go to their lacrosse game, they bring out a service guy. A hockey game, they bring out a service guy.
Yes, I wish we did more of that.
I think so too. Yeah, it's hard to, like, it has happened. Like a friend of ours' son has been in these places where they've acknowledged the military. I know they do it, and in what Hamilton football field.
Yep,
they do it there. They acknowledge the military there as well. So when I went to watch the Ticats, they were acknowledging that too.
I like it, and there's nothing better than watching American football game when they all come out and start singing and that, the military.
Yeah, they do it in a big way.
Yeah, our
they're
guys.
big way.
Yeah, our guy Don Cherry says wear a poppy. It's the least you can do, and he gets fired.
Yeah, that was they wanted to get rid of them, the idiots. They didn't know what they had. I mean, Jerry bugged a lot of people, but he was a one of a kind of person.
He was a patriot.
Yeah, and he was. I don't know. Like you won't find a guy like that around anymore.
No. There's that's what you call an old timer.
You bet.
Right from the old days. Yeah. That's it. There's a few left, but we're losing them more and more.
Yeah.
We're the old timers now, Dave.
Yeah, really. Yeah,
we're the guys.
I keep forgetting about that. Yeah.
I mean, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't.
I'm shocked when people ask my advice. Why do you ask my? Oh, because I'm old. I've been there, done that.
You look old and wise. Anyway, my name is Paul Killamere. This is Your City, Your Voice, coming to you live from downtown Niagara Falls, Ontario on Remembrance Day. Studios of 4680Q. My buddy Dave Wheeler came in to honor us with his presence on Remembrance Day.
Honor the vets.
Honor the vets. Wear your poppy all day and put it away for next year. Make sure you wear one. It's the least we can do, lest we forget.
Lest we forget.
Take care, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. We'll talk to you tomorrow with City Council agenda review, and Dave will be in for that as well.
That's right.
You haven't had enough of them after today.
Yeah.
You got all day. You got another hour tomorrow.
Send in your complaints, Dave.
See you later, everybody. Thank you for tuning in.